The house was holding its breath. Vance Manor, once a sprawling monument to northern prestige, had become a mausoleum of rot and gilded lies, draped in the heavy velvet of a dying era. Outside, the northern Highlands exhaled a mist so thick it seemed to swallow the very stone of the estate, while inside the air was heavy with the scent of cheap tallow candles attempting to mask the odor of damp floorboards and the stale, lingering smoke of a hearth that had not seen a proper coal fire in weeks. It was a residence of echoes, the echo of wealth long since gambled away, the echo of footsteps belonging to servants who had long since departed for more solvent masters. Lady Catherine Vance stood at the head of the long mahogany table, her fingers twitching against the lace of a gown that had been turned and mended so many times it was more thread than fabric. She was counting. Not the silverware, for most of that had been replaced by pewter years ago, but the imaginary gold that she believed would soon restore the Vance name to its former glory. Lady Elara Vance sat across from her mother, her spine a column of unforgiving iron. She was brown-haired, where her mother was a fading gold, sharp-featured, where the elder woman was soft with the remnants of vanity. Elara did not look at the empty crystal glasses or the meager portion of roasted mutton that sat cooling on her plate. Instead, she looked at the shadows dancing across the peeling wallpaper. Her fingers, tucked beneath the table, were stained with ink, a permanent mark of her secret labor. For 7 years, Elara had acted as the ghost of the estate, managing the ledgers in the dead of night, calculating the precise arithmetic of their ruin while her mother played the role of a grand dame in the village. Elara understood the weight of debt. She knew that the silence in this house had teeth, and those teeth were currently closing around their very lives. The arrival of the guest was heralded not by a fanfare, but by the heavy predatory thud of boots on the stairs. Julian Vane, the Baron of Blackfriar, entered the dining room with the casual arrogance of a lord who already owned the air he breathed. He was a man of significant girth and even more significant cruelty, his eyes the color of stagnant pond water. He did not bow to the ladies, he merely stood in the doorway, his gaze raking over the room with a clinical, disparaging greed. To the Baron, the faded tapestries and the chipped moulding were not signs of tragedy, but leverage. He looked at Lady Catherine with a sneer that passed for a smile, and then his eyes settled on Elara. It was an inspection, the way a horse dealer might examine the hock of a mare at a country fair. He walked slowly around the table, the floorboards groaning under his weight, until he stood directly behind Elara's chair. The Baron reached out a hand, his thick fingers hovering inches from Elara's neck. He did not touch her, but the heat of his proximity was a violation in itself. Lady Catherine did not protest. In fact, she leaned forward, her eyes bright with a desperate, feverish light. She was selling her daughter, and she was doing it with the practiced grace of a hostess offering tea. The Baron's voice, when he spoke, was like the sound of gravel grinding in a mortar. He noted the line of her jaw, the clarity of her skin, and the strength of her constitution. He spoke of Elara as if she were a piece of fine porcelain being appraised for a private collection. Lady Catherine nodded eagerly at every remark, her hands fluttering like trapped birds. The arithmetic was simple and devastating. Elara was the payment for the smuggling debts that Catherine had accrued in a mad attempt to maintain their social standing. She was the currency that would keep the Baron's hounds from their door. Elara felt the coldness of the room seep into her marrow. She did not flinch when the Baron leaned down to inhale the scent of the dried lavender she used to scent her hair. She did not speak when her mother began to discuss the particulars of a wedding date as though they were discussing the weather. To Julian Vane, Elara was a prize to be broken. To her mother, she was a shield against the consequences of her own avarice. But beneath the stoic exterior, Elara's mind was moving with the precision of a clockwork mechanism. She had seen the way the Baron looked at the ledgers when he thought she was not watching. She knew that he did not just want a wife. He wanted the Vance lands to hide his illegal cargo. The dinner was not a social engagement. It was an auction, and the hammer was about to fall. When the Baron finally departed, leaving the house smelling of expensive tobacco and expensive malice, Lady Catherine collapsed into her chair, a hysterical laugh bubbling in her throat. She spoke of the silk dresses Elara would soon wear, of the carriage and the servants that would return to the manor. She ignored the way Elara stood up, her movements slow and deliberate. Elara did not scream, and she did not weep. Melodramatic outbursts were for those who still had hope. Instead, she walked toward the heavy oak door of her father's old study. The room was officially forbidden to her, but the lock was a simple thing, and Elara had mastered many things in the shadows of the last 7 years. She needed to see the truth. She needed to see the ink on the page that had signed her life away. The study was a cavern of cold air and the smell of ancient dust. It was the only room in the house that remained honest, for it contained the documents that Lady Catherine refused to acknowledge. Elara lit a single candle, the flame flickering wildly in the draught. She went straight to the mahogany desk, her smudge-marked digits moving with scrupulous intent. She knew the secret compartment behind the second drawer, Her father had shown it to her when she was a child, a small intimacy that felt like a lifeline across the years. Inside lay a bundle of papers tied with a black ribbon. As she unfurled the first parchment, the candlelight caught the harsh, slanted handwriting of the Baron and the desperate, shaky signature of her mother. It was not a marriage contract, it was a bill of sale, drafted with the cold efficiency of a ledger. The numbers on the page were staggering. £20,000, that was the price of her life. But as Elara scanned the documents further, her competence in estate accounting revealed a darker layer to the transaction. The debt was not merely a result of bad investments or high-stakes gambling, it was a smuggling contract. Her mother had allowed the Baron to use the Vance family's private cove for the transport of contraband, and when the authorities had begun to close in, the Baron had manufactured a debt to force the family into a permanent alliance. If Elara married him, she would not just be a wife, she would be a co-conspirator, a legal anchor that would prevent the Baron from ever facing the gallows. Her mother had not just sold her for gold, she had sold her to be a human shield for a criminal. The door to the study and Lady Catherine stood there, her silhouette framed by the dim light of the hallway. She looked small and frail until the light caught the hardness in her eyes. She did not ask what Elara was doing. She walked into the room, her footsteps silent on the threadbare carpet, and snatched the papers from Elara's hand. Her voice was not the voice of a mother, it was the voice of a creditor demanding payment. She spoke of the shame of poverty, of the horror of being looked down upon by the neighbors in the village. She told Elara that her duty was to the name, to the bloodline, and to the survival of the house. To Catherine, the architecture of the soul was a concept she could not grasp. She only understood the architecture of a manor she could no longer afford to heat. "You will marry him," Lady Catherine whispered, her face inches from Elara's. "You will marry him because I cannot go back to wearing cotton. You will marry him because the alternative is a debtor's prison for me and the gutter for you. You are the only asset I have left, Elara. Do not think your intelligence makes you any less of a bargain." The words were like stones hitting the bottom of a deep well. Catherine did not care about the Baron's cruelty or the illegal nature of his business. She cared only for the facade. She had wrapped her bitterness around herself like a heavy cloak for 7 years, and she had decided that Elara's happiness was a small price to pay for a new winter coat. The silence that followed was heavy, a suffocating blanket of betrayal that filled the study until the candles sputtered and died. Elara stood in the darkness, her heart beating a steady, rhythmic defiance. She realized then that being seen by the right person was not the danger. It was being seen by her mother that had nearly destroyed her. Her mother saw a daughter as a commodity, a ledger entry to be balanced against a life of vanity. But Elara saw a woman who was solvent in her own right, a woman who knew the value of a hard day's work and the weight of a clean conscience. She thought of the village square, of the ancient laws that still governed their parish, and of the labourer she noticed in the stables, the scarred labourer the village called Shadow Arthur. He was a beggar in the eyes of society, a man who lived in a derelict hut and spoke to no one, but Elara had seen the way he moved. He carried himself with a lethal, quiet grace that no common labourer possessed. The decision formed in Elara's mind, not as a desperate flight but as a calculated manoeuvre. If her mother wanted a marriage of convenience to settle a debt, Elara would give her one, but it would not be the marriage the Baron expected. She would invoke the ancient parish law of the Highlands, a law that allowed a woman of noble birth to claim a husband of her own, choosing to protect her from a forced union, provided the marriage was witnessed and recorded before the sun reached its zenith. It was a law of the poor, a law of the desperate, and it was the only weapon Elara had left. She would marry a beggar to defy her mother, and in doing so, she would burn the bridges of her old life to the ground. She did not know that the man she was choosing was a storm waiting to break, but she knew that any fate was better than the Baron's bed. Elara turned her back on her mother and walked out of the study, her footsteps firm on the cold stone floor. She did not take any of her fine dresses nor the jewelry that was mostly paste and glass. She took only a small leather-bound book of Latin poetry her father had loved and a single brass farthing she had found in the dirt of the garden weeks ago. It was a low-value coin, a symbol of the poverty she was about to embrace, but to Elara it felt heavier than all the Baron's gold. She would offer this coin as her dowry, a testament to her integrity. As she reached the heavy front door of the manor, she looked back once. The estate stood in suffocating silence, and at long last Elara was no longer waiting for it to exhale. She stepped out into the rain, the cold Highlands air a sharp, clean shock against her skin, and began to walk toward the village. The path was muddy, the slate-grey sky promising a downpour that would wash away the stench of the manor. Elara did not look back. She knew that by morning, her name would be a scandal, a stain on the Vance history that her mother could never scrub away. But as she walked, the suffocating dread that had lived in her chest for years began to lift. She was no longer a bargaining chip. She was a woman with a plan. She would find Arthur Sterling, The man with the scarred hands and the silent eyes, and she would offer him a life that was honest, if not easy. She thought of the ledgers she had kept, the numbers that had told her the truth when everyone else had lied. Numbers did not lie, and the arithmetic of her survival was now clear. She would choose the beggar, and she would let the house of Vance crumble into the mist, where it belonged. The dawn arrived in the northern Highlands not as a herald of hope, but as a creditor demanding payment in light for a debt of sleep. The sky was the color of a fresh bruise, a deep violet gray that bled into the edges of the mist-shrouded peaks, and the air carried the sharp, metallic scent of a storm that had not yet exhausted its fury. Lady Elara Vance walked through the knee-high heather, her boots sinking into the peat-saturated earth with every step. She did not feel the cold that seeped through the wool of her traveling cloak, nor did she heed the way the damp wind pulled strands of dark hair from her modest coil. Her mind was a ledger of calculated risks, and the arithmetic of her current path was the only thing keeping her spine as straight as a soldier's pike. Behind her, Vance Manor sat like a gargantuan, dying beast in the fog, its stone ribs holding the secrets of Catherine's avarice. Ahead lay the village of Oakhaven, a cluster of slate-roofed cottages that huddled together for warmth against the indifference of the moor. Elara reached the village square just as the first tallow lamps were being lit. The square was a cobblestone island in a sea of mud, dominated by a weathered stone cross and the iron-gated entrance to the parish church. It was here that the ancient laws of the Highlands were still whispered, laws that predated the polished proprieties of London and the stifling reach of the Baron's influence. She scanned the few early morning labourers, her gaze searching for the one man who could serve as her shield. She found him near the blacksmith's forge, standing in the shadow of a low stone wall. Arthur Sterling, the man the locals called Shadow Arthur, was a silhouette of suppressed strength. He was currently stacking heavy timber, his movements possessed of a rhythmic, lethal grace that stood in stark contrast to his tattered burlap coat and the scars that mapped his jawline. He had worn his grief like weather for 7 years, or perhaps it was a different sort of burden, for his eyes were not those of a broken man, but of one who had chosen silence as a fortress. As Elara approached, he did not stop his work immediately. He lifted a massive beam of oak, his muscles coiling under the rough fabric of his shirt, and set it upon the pile with a muffled thud. Only then did he turn his head. His eyes were the color of the Highland sky before a blizzard, a piercing, intelligent gray that seemed to measure the very architecture of her soul. He did not bow, for a man who owns nothing owes no one a gesture of subservience. He merely stood there, his breath hitching in the cold air, waiting for her to speak. "Arthur Sterling," Elara said, her voice steady despite the hammer thud of her heart. She stood before him, the daughter of a lady facing an outcast living in a derelict hut. Yet she did not feel superior. In fact, in the presence of his stillness, she felt the flimsy nature of her own title. "I am told you are a man who understands the value of a contract that is not written in ink but in blood and iron." Arthur did not answer immediately. He wiped his calloused hands on his trousers, his gaze fixed on the darkened tips of her fingers. He noted the way she clutched her father's book of poetry and the lack of jewelry on her person. He was a man who saw the truth of things, a man who looked at a grave and did not see the headstone but the depth of the earth beneath. "Lady Elara," he replied, his voice a low, resonant rumble. It was not the voice of a common labourer. It lacked the coarse vowels of the local dialect, yet it was stripped of any aristocratic pretension. "The village square is an unusual place for a woman of the manor to seek a stranger dwelling among the shadows. What arithmetic has brought you to my feet on a morning as bitter as this?" He did not look away. The silence between them had teeth biting into the propriety of the moment. Elara did not flinch. She reached into the pocket of her cloak and withdrew the brass farthing, the low-value coin, catching the pale, weak light of the rising sun. She held it out on her palm, a symbol of the poverty she was prepared to embrace to escape a fate far worse than hunger. "I seek to invoke the law of the lowly," Elara declared, her words carrying across the square to the few villagers who had paused to watch. "The spousals of the Highlands, I offer you this farthing as my dowry and my hand as your wife. I do not offer you a fortune, for my mother has gambled it away. I do not offer you a name, for I intend to bury it in the mud of this square. I offer you my competence, my loyalty, and a life that is honest if not easy." The onlookers gasped, a collective intake of breath. To marry a beggar was a scandal. To do so publicly, to defy the Baron and the Dowager's plans, was a form of social suicide. But Elara watched Arthur's face. She saw a flicker of something in those grey eyes. Not pity, but a recognition that was as sharp as a duelist's blade. Arthur Sterling stepped closer, the scent of damp wool and wood smoke clinging to him. He looked at the brass farthing, and then he looked at the woman who held it. He saw that the iron in her spine and the intelligence that burned in her gaze. He was a nobleman having spent months in this village to dismantle a network of corruption. Yet in this moment he was simply a man faced with a woman of remarkable courage. He had lived in a world of gilded lies for too long, where women were traded like livestock and men were measured by the weight of their coin. Elara Vance was offering him something he had not seen in 7 years, a heart that refused to be a bill of sale. "You realize what you are asking?" Arthur whispered, his hand hovering near hers. "If you take my name, the House of Vance will collapse, your mother will disown you, the Baron will hunt you, you will trade your silk for burlap and your mahogany for a dirt floor. Is the defiance of your mother worth the price of your soul?" He was testing her, not out of cruelty, but out of a need to know if the foundation of her resolve was stone or sand. Elara did not hesitate. She closed her hand over the coin and then reached out to grasp his rough, scarred fingers. The contact was a sudden grounding that made the world around them fall away. "I am the payment, sir," Elara said, her voice dropping to a whisper that only he could hear. "I have spent my life as a ledger entry in a book that was never mine to read. I would rather be a beggar's wife and keep my own soul than be a baron's prize and lose it. I have calculated the cost, and I find the price of freedom to be worth every farthing of my dignity." Arthur felt a thaw begin in the frozen chambers of his heart. For 7 years he had worn his armor of isolation, but this woman, with her ink-stained fingers and her straight spine, was the first person who looked at him and did not see a grave. He saw in her a partner, a mind that could match his own and a spirit that could weather any storm. The moment was interrupted by Silas Thorne, Arthur's most trusted captain. He stepped out from the doorway of the parish office, dressed in the plain clothes of a village clerk, but carrying the disciplined stillness of a veteran having survived a dozen campaigns. He held the parish ledger and a small jar of black ink. Silas looked from Arthur to Elara, a glint of grim satisfaction in his eyes. He knew the Duke's plan and the necessity of the mission, but he also knew that the woman standing before them was the only person who could truly save the man Arthur Sterling had become. "The law must be observed if the union is to be legal," Silas said, his voice clipped and professional. He opened the ledger on a small wooden podium near the stone cross. "Lady Elara Vance, you invoke the ancient spousals of the Highlands. Arthur Sterling, you accept this woman as your wife and protector under the parish law. Is this the truth of your hearts?" The air in the square seemed to thicken, the very stones of the village holding their breath as the words were spoken. This was the point of no return. Beyond this signature lay a life of hardship, of scandal, and of a dangerous game played in the shadows of power. Arthur took the pen first. He signed the name Arthur Sterling in a script that was too elegant for a laborer, a slanted, authoritative hand that suggested a man of high education. Then he handed the pen to Elara. She looked at the ledger, the one honest room in a world built on lies. She saw the names of generations of villagers who had married for love or survival. She dipped the nib into the ink and signed her name for the last time as a daughter of the House of Vance. As the ink dried, a heavy, rhythmic thud echoed through the square. The sound of a grand carriage pulled by 4 black horses approached with the speed of an invading army. Lady Catherine Vance arrived not as a mother, but as a fury. The carriage door swung open and the dowager stepped out into the mud, her silk pelisse dragging in the filth. She was a vision of fading grandeur and sharpening desperation. She did not look at Arthur, her gaze snapped to the ledger and then focused on her daughter. Behind her, the village children huddled in doorways, and the older men watched the fall of a noble house with awe. Catherine's voice, when it broke the silence, was like the sound of glass shattering on a marble floor. "You wretched, ungrateful girl!" Catherine shrieked, her hands clenching into claws. She stormed toward the stone cross. "You would throw away £20,000 for a man who smells of the stables. You would marry a beggar to spite the mother who has sacrificed everything to keep a roof over your head. This is not a marriage, it is a sickness." She reached out to snatch the ledger, but Silas Thorne stepped forward, his body a solid wall of iron that blocked her path. He did not touch her, but the lethal intent in his posture made her recoil. Silas did not speak. He merely looked at her with cold indifference. Elara stood her ground, her hand still resting in Arthur's. She scowled at the villagers, who were now nodding in silent approval. In her desperation, she reached for the only weapon she had left, the power of erasure. "Then you are nothing to me," Catherine screamed, the words echoing off the slate roofs. "I strip you of your name. I strip you of your inheritance. I disown you before these witnesses. You will leave this parish with nothing but the shift on your back, and you will never darken the door of Vance Manor again. You are a beggar's wife, and you shall live a beggar's life until the cold takes you." She began to pull at Elara's cloak, the expensive wool a mockery of her new status. With a violent tug, she ripped the garment from Elara's shoulders, leaving her standing in the thin, grey morning light in a common linen shift. The villagers gasped at the cruelty, but Arthur Sterling did not allow the humiliation to land. Before the cloak could hit the mud, he had stripped off his own heavy burlap coat and draped it around Elara's shoulders. The garment was oversized and smelled of wood smoke and rain, but to Elara it felt like the most expensive silk. It was warm, solid, and a promise of protection that her mother had never once offered. Arthur stepped between Elara and her mother, his grey eyes turning to ice. He did not raise his hand, but the power that radiated from him was so immense that Lady Catherine took 3 steps back. "You have said your piece, Lady Catherine," Arthur said, his tone as even as a funeral bell. "You have cast her out, and I have taken her in. The House of Vance has no further claim on this woman. I suggest you return to your manor and prepare your soul for the storm that is coming, for the numbers you have hidden in your father's desk are known to more than just your daughter. Go, before the mud of this square is the only thing you have left to your name." Lady Catherine stared at him, her mouth opening and closing. She saw something in his face, a shadow of a power she could not comprehend, and the arrogance was replaced by a flicker of primal fear. She turned and fled to her carriage, the vehicle disappearing into the mist. The village square returned to a heavy silence, broken only by the wind. Elara stood in the center, wrapped in a beggar's coat, a brass farthing still clutched in her hand. She was disowned and destitute, but as she looked at Arthur, she realized that the stifling tension had broken. After 7 long years, she could finally exhale. Arthur looked down at her, a ghost of a smile touching his scarred lips. "Welcome to the road, Elara Sterling," he whispered. "It will be a hard journey, but I promise you this, you will never have to keep a ledger for a lie again." Together, they began to walk away, 2 shadows moving into the mist of the Highlands. The carriage of Lady Catherine Vance did not merely depart. It retreated like a wounded, spiteful animal into the grey shroud of the northern English Highlands. The rhythmic thud of the horses' hooves on the saturated earth was the only sound that dared to puncture the oppressive stillness of the village square. Lady Elara Vance stood exactly where she had been cast, her feet rooted in the freezing northern mud that was already claiming the hem of her common shift. The burlap was a cruel, abrasive weight against her skin, a sudden and violent transition from the whispering silk she had worn only moments before. It smelled of damp grain and the ancient, earthy scent of a cellar, a fragrance of the soil rather than the salon. Her mother had not just stripped her of a garment, she had attempted to strip her of her very history, leaving her a tabula rasa in the middle of a public square. The villagers watched from the peripheries, their faces etched with a complex blend of pity and a dark satisfaction at the fall of a dynasty that had long suffocated them. Arthur Sterling remained a silent, immovable pillar beside her, his presence a stark contrast to the frantic energy of her mother's departure. He did not immediately urge her to move. Instead, he allowed the reality of her choice to settle around them like the mist. The heavy coat he had draped over her shoulders was the only thing standing between her and the biting indifference of the wind. It was a garment that possessed its own architecture, rue sturdy and redolent of the man who wore it. It carried the scent of wood smoke, rain, and a faint sharp undertone of bergamot that seemed entirely out of place for a laborer. Elara clutched the lapels, her marked hands trembling not from fear, but from the sudden clarity of her liberation. She had spent 7 years for Zouders calculating the precise arithmetic of her ruin, and now that the total had been reached, she found the result remarkably light. Within her pocket, the brass farthing felt like a small hot ember, the only currency of integrity she had left. "The square is no longer our counting house, Elara," Arthur Sterling said, his voice a low, resonant frequency that seemed to vibrate in the very stones beneath their feet. He looked at the gathered crowd, his grey eyes turning to flint, and the villagers quickly found urgent business elsewhere, their gazes dropping to the mud. He reached out, his scarred hand hovering for a moment before he gently took the small leather-bound book of poetry from her grasp. He tucked it into a deep interior pocket of his own waistcoat, a gesture of preservation that felt more intimate than a touch. "We must walk. The cold is a creditor that does not accept excuses, and we have many miles to cover before the sun loses its argument with the clouds." He did not offer her a carriage or a horse. He offered her the honesty of the road, and to Elara, it was the first genuine thing she had owned in a lifetime. As they began to move away from the village of Oakhaven, the architecture of Elara's old life began to dissolve into the fog. Every step was a deliberate erasure of the lady she had been forced to play. The burlap shift chafed against her thighs, a constant, tactile reminder of her new station, yet she found herself walking with a spine that felt more constitutionally sound than it ever had in the parlor of Vance Manor. She thought of the smuggling bill of sale still hidden in her mother's desk, and the predatory gaze of Baron Vane. The physical discomfort of the journey was a small price to pay for the removal of that particular debt. She watched the way Arthur Sterling moved, with a lethal, fluid grace that suggested he was not walking through the northern terrain but commanding it. He navigated the treacherous, peat-soaked paths with the precision of someone having mapped the world and found it wanting. The journey was a slow burn of sensory endurance. The rain, which had been a fine mist in the village, evolved into a cold, persistent drizzle that sought out every vulnerability in their clothing. The desolate northern uplands were not a host. They were a witness, indifferent to the social status of those who traversed their peaks. Elara found herself counting her breaths, matching them to the steady thud of Arthur's boots. She realized that she had spent 7 years in a state of emotional stasis, waiting for a storm that had finally arrived. Being seen by the right person was not the danger, she reminded herself as she looked at the broad shoulders of the man walking before her. The danger was remaining invisible in a home paralyzed by its own secrets. The silence between them was not the empty silence of the manor, but a dense, purposeful quiet that felt like the precursor to a revelation. By the time the light began to fail, turning the sky the color of cold slate, they reached a derelict barn situated on the edge of a neglected sheep run. It was a skeletal structure of grey timber and moss-covered stone, its roof sagging under the weight of decades of neglect. To a lady of the north it would have been a ruin. To Lady Elara Vance it was a sanctuary. The house of Vance had been a mausoleum of gilded lies, but this barn was an honest room, offering nothing but the shelter of its bones. Arthur pushed the heavy, groaning door aside and led her into the dim interior. The air inside was still and carried the scent of old hay and dried heather. It was a space that did not demand propriety or performance. Arthur Sterling immediately set to work with a scrupulous efficiency that fascinated Elara. He did not fumble or complain about the lack of amenities. Within minutes, he had cleared a space in the cleanest corner and produced a tinderbox from his pack. The small, flickering flame he coaxed into life was the first warmth Elara had felt since she stepped out of the manor. He did not speak, but his movements were a language of their own, a vocabulary of competence that spoke of a survivor having mastered the art of survival long before he ever picked up a plow. He found an old, rusted washing basin near a disused pump and, after a few rhythmic strokes, filled it with water that he heated over the small fire. "Sit," Arthur Sterling commanded gently, pointing to a low pile of dry hay he had covered with a spare piece of canvas. Elara obeyed, her legs feeling like leaden weights. As she sank down, the adrenaline of the day finally ebbed, leaving behind a raw, pulsing exhaustion. She looked at her feet, which were encased in boots that were never meant for such a trek. When she tried to pull them off, she winced. The leather had rubbed her skin raw, and the salt from the northern mud had found its way into the blisters. Before she could protest or attempt the task herself, Arthur knelt before her. The sight of a man, the spouse she recently wed, kneeling in the dirt to tend to her felt like a subversion of every social ledger she had ever studied. He took her foot in his hand with a tenderness that was almost jarring given the calloused, scarred nature of his skin. His touch was not that of a laborer, but of someone who understood the delicate machinery of the human body. He removed her boots and stockings with a surgical precision, his gaze focused entirely on the wounds. The water in the washing basin was warm, and as he began to bathe her feet, the relief was so profound that Elara felt a sob catch in her throat. She suppressed it, her spine remaining straight even in her vulnerability. Arthur did not look up, but his voice was soft, cutting through the shadows of the barn. "Tears are not forever, Elara, but the salt from them can sting as much as the mud if you do not wash it away." As he worked, Elara noticed something that made her breath hitch. He was not just washing her feet. He was inspecting the blisters with a degree of medical knowledge that was far beyond the reach of a common village laborer. He produced a small, leather-wrapped kit from his bag, not the crude tools of a farrier, but a set of clean silver instruments and a selection of dried herbs that smelled of lavender and comfrey. He applied a poultice with a deftness that suggested years of study, his fingers moving with a grace that Elara had only ever seen in the high-priced physicians her father had occasionally summoned from Edinburgh. The arithmetic of his identity was beginning to shift in her mind, the numbers no longer adding up to a simple beggar. "You have the hands of a scholar, Arthur," Elara whispered, her eyes tracing the line of his jaw in the flickering firelight. "A laborer does not know how to treat a heel with such medical precision. A laborer does not carry silver lancets in a burlap coat." Arthur Sterling paused, his hand still resting on her ankle. For a moment, the silence in the barn had teeth, sharp and inquisitive. He looked up, and for the first time, Elara saw past the scars and the dirt to the architecture of the man beneath. His grey eyes were not those of a victim of circumstance, but of a master of it. He did not deny her observation, but he did not confirm it either. "In 7 years, Elara, I have learned that the world sees only what it expects to see," Arthur replied, his voice carrying a weight of suppressed grief that seemed to mirror her own. "They see a beggar because I wear the coat of one. They see a laborer because I do the work of one. But a ledger is the only honest room in the world, and if you look at the entries carefully, you will find that I have never lied to you. I am Arthur Sterling. I am the man you married to defy your mother. Is that not enough for a single night in a derelict barn?" He resumed his work, his touch remaining gentle. Yet there was a new tension in the air, a shared secrecy that felt like the first foundation of a bridge between their worlds. Elara watched him, her heart beating a steady, rhythmic cadence. She thought of the leather-bound book belonging to her father, and the way Arthur Sterling had looked at it in the square. She thought of the way he had stood against Lady Catherine, not with the bravado of a commoner, but with the cold, iron-hard authority of a sovereign. She realized then that being seen by the right person was indeed the only safety worth the name. Arthur saw her not as a lady to be sold or a daughter to be managed, but as a woman with a mind that could calculate the stars, and in return she was beginning to see him. Not as the beggar he claimed to be, but as a man who carried a kingdom in the silence of his soul. The fire sputtered, casting long, dancing shadows against the grey timber walls. Outside, the wind continued its mournful dialogue with the stone of these remote English moors, but inside the barn the oppressive stillness was gone. Elara leaned back against the hay, her feet clean and bound in soft linen strips Arthur had provided. The abrasive texture of the burlap shift was still there, but it no longer felt like a punishment. It felt like armor. She stared into the washing basin, the water now clouded with the mud of her old life, and realized that she had left more than just a name in the village square. She had left the fear of being undervalued. As sleep began to pull at the edges of her consciousness, she watched Arthur bank the fire, his silhouette strong and certain against the dark. She was a beggar's wife, and never before had she felt so certain she was exactly where she was meant to be. The quiet of the barn was a living thing, a sanctuary that felt earned through the fire of her defiance. Arthur Sterling moved to the other side of the fire, wrapping himself in a thin blanket and leaning against a support beam. He did not ask for more than she was willing to give, and he did not offer more than he felt she could handle. It was a partnership based on the scrupulous observation of boundaries and the silent recognition of shared weight. Elara closed her eyes, the scent of wood smoke and lavender lulling her into a deep rest. The road ahead would be hard, and Baron Vane would undoubtedly be counting the hours until his revenge, but as she drifted off, she knew that the arithmetic of her survival was finally in her own hands. A heart once thought beyond redemption was proving itself remarkably resilient in the presence of an equal who looked at her and did not see a grave. The derelict barn seemed to exhale as the fire settled into a steady pulse of orange and ember. It was a skeleton of ancient timber that had forgotten the harvests it once sheltered. Lady Elara Vance lay upon the hay, the burlap of her shift a coarse but honest weight, and watched through the veil of her eyelashes. She had learned the art of stillness in the airless corridors of Vance Manor, where a daughter's silence was the currency that bought peace from Lady Catherine's scrutiny. Here, in the shadows of the northern Highlands, her silence was a vantage point. The small circle of warmth felt more secure than the grand, empty hearths of her childhood. In those rooms, the fire had always been a performance. Here it was a necessity, as vital as the man who had built it. Arthur Sterling sat by the hearth, his silhouette carved from the darkness with the hard lines of a mountain crag. He believed Elara to be asleep, having watched her breathing settle into a measured cadence of rest, but her mind was a ledger of observations that refused to balance. She watched as he reached into the depths of his own weathered pack and withdrew a thick, ancient volume. It was the Latin Codex, an old, corrected manuscript that bore the weight of decades of rigorous study. Elara instinctively pressed her hand against her cloak, feeling the familiar, comforting weight of the Latin poetry book belonging to her father. It was the only piece of the Vance legacy she had deemed worth the journey safe against her side. Seeing Arthur handle his own scholarly text with such calloused, scarred hands felt like a collision of two worlds that should never have met. In the flickering light, Arthur Sterling did not merely glance at the pages as a curious laborer might. He held the Latin Codex with a reverence uncharacteristic of a man claiming to live in a derelict hut. His fingers turned the vellum with a delicacy that suggested he understood the fragile architecture of the words. Elara's heart did a strange syncopated dance. A man who lives among pigsties and shadows does not navigate ancient text as if it were a familiar map. She watched him pull a piece of graphite from his coat with quiet, scholarly intent. He leaned closer to the fire, the light illuminating the aristocratic line of his jaw and the scars that hinted at a world far more complex than the Forge of Oakhaven. He read a passage. She recognized the dactylic hexameter even from across the room, and paused, his brow furrowing in profound intellectual dissatisfaction. With a steady hand, he made a scrupulous correction in the margin of his codex. He was not just reading the poetry. He was editing it. He was correcting a meter that had stood for centuries with the effortless authority belonging to one who spent his life in the company of scholars. The sight sent a cold, sharp shock through Elara. The arithmetic of his identity was fundamentally flawed. His melancholia had clung to him relentlessly for 7 years, a sorrow wearing a man's coat too large for the role he played. Who was Arthur Sterling, and why had a man of such profound competence chosen to vanish into the mud? Elara shifted slightly, the hay rustling, and Arthur immediately went still. He did not snap the book shut with the guilt of a thief. Instead, he closed it slowly, his thumb lingering on the page. He tucked the volume away and turned his gaze toward her, his grey eyes unreadable in the gloom. He did not speak, and neither did she. The silence, it seemed, had teeth, Lady Elara Vance watched him bank the fire, his movements as precise as the Latin he had just refined. She realized she was not just married to a beggar. She was married to a mystery, a man whose soul was built on a scale she had only begun to measure. As she drifted into sleep, her smudged fingertips curled into the hay, she felt a terrifying sense of safety. She was no longer a bargaining chip in her mother's ledger. She was a woman standing at the edge of an unknown territory, and for the first time she was not afraid of the dark. The morning arrived as a creditor, demanding the resumption of their toil in the cold, grey light of the freezing northern peaks. The mist was thick, possessing a physical weight that turned the world into a monochromatic landscape of damp slate and skeletal heather. The cold was an entity of its own, an unforgiving auditor demanding a toll from every joint and muscle. Elara woke to the smell of fresh pine and the rhythmic sound of a knife shaving wood. Arthur Sterling was already awake by the threshold of the barn. He was working upon a sturdy branch of rowan, his hands moving with a lethal grace as he transformed the raw wood into something purposeful. He did not look up as she rose, her movements stiff. The linen bandages he had applied the night before were clean and tight, a testament to a medical precision that still haunted her thoughts. He finished the final shave and stood, presenting her with a walking stick smoothed with scrupulous care. It was a simple object, yet it possessed a balance that made it feel like a sovereign scepter rather than a pauper's crutch. "A scepter for the road, Elara," he said, his voice carrying a low resonant frequency that grounded her like stone. "The path today will be steeper than yesterday, and the mountains do not suffer those who do not lean upon their own strength." He did not offer his hand to help her stand. He offered her the tool to stand herself. It was a gesture of respect that felt more profound than any bow she had received in the ballrooms of the South. They stepped out into the mist, the barn standing silently behind them as they began the long ascent into the wild northern territory. The journey was a symphony of physical endurance. Every mile was a debt paid in muscle and breath, the steep incline testing the limits of her sheltered upbringing. Yet Elara did not falter. The terrain demanded a scrupulous ledger of their resources, and she measured each step, mentally cataloguing the shifting loose stones, the slick patches of waterlogged peat, and the sudden treacherous drops hidden by the fog. The scent of crushed gorse rose around them, a sharp, untamed perfume that smelled entirely of survival. Skeletal heather scraped against the hem of her coarse shift, the hardy shrubs clinging to the granite with a tenacity she recognized within her own spirit. She watched the mist cling to the deep valleys below, turning the world into an unyielding canvas of greys. They possessed no maps, relying entirely on the grim arithmetic of their forward momentum and the quiet, steady compass of his direction. Every breath of freezing air felt like a testament to her rebellion. The heavy coat Arthur had given her felt like a shield against the punishing cold, and her fingers brushed the brass farthing in her pocket, its cold surface a reminder of the price she had paid for this freedom. As they walked, the silence between them began to thaw, replaced by a dialogue that felt like the sparring of two minds meeting their match. They discussed the logistics of survival and the architecture of the land. Elara found herself using the skills she had honed in the dead of night at Vance Manor, calculating their pace, the incline, and the remaining daylight with a precision that made Arthur watch her with a new, quiet intensity. "I have been considering the days that led us here, Arthur," Elara said, her voice cutting through the muffled silence of the woods. "I have been thinking about Lady Catherine and the state of the manor. For 20 years, I lived in rooms draped in velvet and mahogany, surrounded by the physical evidence of my rank. I sat at a table where the crystal was clear, yet I never felt like a lady. I felt like a ledger entry, a silent number waiting to be balanced against a debt I did not incur. I was a ghost in my own house, holding my breath so I would not disturb the gilded lies that kept the roof from falling." She paused, her rowan stick striking the damp earth with a steady rhythm. The physical toil of the walk was bringing a flush to her cheeks and a clarity to her thoughts she had never known in the suffocating stillness maintained by her mother. She looked at her husband, whose grey eyes were fixed on the path ahead, though she knew he listened with every fibre of his being. "My thoughts dwell upon the nature of Baron Vane and the way he looked at me, as if I were a piece of land to be surveyed and exploited. But today, in these rags, with the mud of the trail on my hem and the wind claiming my hair, I feel more like a lady than I ever did at Vance Manor. I feel constitutionally sound, Arthur Sterling. There is an honesty in this burlap that was never present in my silk. I have chosen my master, and I have chosen my road, and for the first time the arithmetic of my life finally adds up to a sum that belongs to me." She did not look for his approval, but she felt the weight of his gaze as he stopped and turned to face her. The mist swirled around them, turning the forest into a cathedral of grey light and ancient stone. Arthur Sterling looked at her, and for a moment, the labourer's facade seemed translucent, revealing a man of immense suppressed power. He looked at her calloused digits wrapped firmly around the Rowan staff, and then at the iron-hard determination in her eyes. "Dignity is not a garment that can be stripped away by a mother's spite or the greed of Baron Vane," he said, his tone as even and heavy as a funeral bell. "It is an architecture of the soul." Lady Catherine believed she was selling a bargaining chip, but she did not realize she was releasing a sovereign. A manor might remain trapped in suffocating silence for 7 years, or 70, but a woman who knows the value of her own heart can teach the world how to breathe again. He reached out, his hand hovering near her shoulder before he turned back to the road. "You are more of a duchess in that burlap shift than any woman I have ever seen in a crown." The words hung in the air, a revelation that felt as heavy as the mountains that surrounded them. But the arithmetic of his disguise had gone unbalanced for too long, and Elara was not a woman who allowed a false ledger to stand. She halted her step, her rowan stick striking the granite path with a decisive crack that echoed through the mist. She did not simply follow him into the deepening shadows in ignorant silence. Instead, she turned, leveling a gaze at him that was as cool and unyielding as the mountain morning. "You speak of crowns and duchesses with the same authority you apply to the Latin Codex, Arthur," Elara said, dropping the pretense of casual conversation. "And last night you did not bind my blistered feet with the rough hands of a laborer. You utilized silver lancets. You possessed the leather-wrapped medical kit of professional make, carrying the scent of lavender and comfrey alongside the unquestionable precision of a surgeon." She stood her ground, her spine straight despite her exhaustion. Where does a man who sleeps in pigsties acquire such implements? Where does he learn to mend flesh with the exactness of a royal physician? Arthur Sterling stopped. The mist seemed to part around his broad shoulders, framing him against the desolate crags like a monument of carved stone. He looked at her, his grey eyes acknowledging the sharp, formidable intellect he had inadvertently provoked. He did not flinch, nor did he offer the panicked deflection of a common thief caught in a lie. Instead, a faint ghost of respect softened the grim line of his mouth. "A man learns to mend what the world breaks, Elara," he said smoothly, the cadence of his voice carrying a dark, melancholic gravity. "Sometimes the most broken things require the sharpest tools." It was a masterfully evasive response, one that maintained the locked vault of his history while explicitly acknowledging her right to demand the truth. The unspoken words between them carried a heavy weight, but Elara did not let it crush her. She simply nodded, accepting the boundary he had drawn, for she understood the necessity of hidden ledgers better than anyone. As they resumed their walk, the road ahead seemed to open up, a clean page upon which they would write a history entirely their own. Her heart, which she had long considered a vault of cold stone, was proving itself remarkably resilient under the harsh, unyielding sky. As the sun began its slow descent toward the jagged peaks of the west, painting the mist in bruised shades of violet and indigo, Lady Elara Vance realized that the sanctuary she had found was not in the architecture of a stone manor, but in the quiet, absolute integrity of the man who walked beside her. The mountain pass was a narrow artery of granite, a claustrophobic throat through which the northern highlands exhaled their frozen, damp breath. The mist here was not a mere atmospheric condition. It was a physical weight, possessing a grey, suffocating density that seemed to absorb the very sound of their footsteps. Lady Elara Vance leaned heavily upon her rowan walking stick, her breath hitching in the thin air, her freezing fingertips numb against the smooth wood. Beside her, Arthur Sterling moved with the unsettling ease of a shadow, his grey eyes scanning the jagged peaks with the scrupulous intent of a commander surveying a battlefield. The silence of the pass was thick, yet it was a silence that possessed teeth, a sharp, predatory stillness that suggested they were no longer the only souls occupying this desolate architecture of stone. She mentally calculated the miles they had covered since Oakhaven, seeking the comfort of mathematics to soothe the ache in her blistered heels. The numbers offered a stark, unforgiving solace. They were entirely alone, suspended between the ruin of the dowager's ambitions and the unknown sanctuary of this stranger's destination. Yet as she watched the steady rhythm of Arthur's shoulders beneath his coarse burlap coat, the arithmetic of her fear began to balance. He had worn his silence like weather for the entirety of their journey, but it was not the cold, isolating silence of Baron Vane's estate. It was the quiet, structural integrity of a load-bearing wall. The ambush was heralded not by a shout, but by the metallic, rhythmic scrape of a whetstone against steel. From the shroud of the mist, 3 figures materialized like ghosts of a failed campaign, blocking the narrow path where the rock gave way to a sheer dizzying drop into the indigo shadows of the valley. They were men of significant ruin, dressed in the mismatched remnants of military livery and smelling of cheap spirits and the bitter rust of a lawless life. The leader, a man with a jagged scar bisecting his lip and eyes as cold as a frozen tarn, stepped forward with the casual arrogance of a predator who had already calculated the value of his prey. He did not look at the beggar. He looked at Lady Elara Vance, his gaze raking over her burlap shift with a disparaging greed that made her skin crawl. "We have been searching for the Baron's property," the leader said, his voice a coarse grate that mimicked the sound of the wind through the pines. Lady Catherine was most precise in her description, though she neglected to mention that her daughter had developed a taste for the company of labourers. He let out a dry, rattling laugh. "Baron Vane is a man of limited patience and significant memory, and he does not take kindly to his investments wandering off into the heather." He did not draw his sword immediately. He merely stood there, his hand resting on the hilt of a heavy, rusted cavalry sabre, his silhouette a dark blot against the shifting grey of the Highlands. To these men, Elara was not a woman. She was a ledger entry, a debt to be collected and returned to the master of Blackfriar. Elara felt the cold iron of dread settle in her marrow, but her spine remained a column of unforgiving defiance. She had not traded the gilded cage of her mother's manor merely to be dragged back by mercenaries. She did not hide behind Arthur Sterling. She stood beside him, her rowan stick gripped with a white-knuckled intensity. The arithmetic of the situation was devastating. 3 armed mercenaries against a woman in rags and a man with a burlap coat. But as she looked at Arthur, she saw a transformation that defied every social law she had ever known. He did not tremble, and he did not plead. Instead, he seemed to expand, his presence occupying the narrow pass with an immense suppressed authority. The laborer's stoop vanished, replaced by the lethal, upright grace of a warrior forged by a lifetime of combat. Arthur Sterling reached into the deep, hidden folds of his pack, his movements so fluid and precise that the mercenaries did not even have time to register the shift in the air. When his hand emerged, it was not holding a tool of the forge, but a dueling blade of exquisite lethal make, a thin length of blue-tempered steel that caught the pale, weak light of the Highlands with a predatory gleam. It was a weapon of high aristocracy, a sovereign's blade that had no business in the hands of a village laborer. The leader of the mercenaries blinked, his arrogance faltering for a single, critical heartbeat as he realized the beggar he had intended to trample possessed the lethal poise of a master duelist. The violence, when it erupted, was not a chaotic brawl. It was an audit of steel, a sequence of movement as cold and measured as a ledger entry. The 2 subordinates lunged forward, their blades swinging in wide, desperate arcs that spoke of barroom brawls and undisciplined rage. Arthur Sterling did not meet their force with force. He moved within the gaps of their aggression, his feet dancing across the slick granite with an arithmetic of motion that left Elara breathless. He parried the first clumsy advance with a mere flick of his wrist. The sound of steel meeting steel rang out like the sharp strike of an arbiter's bell, and in the same measured breath he pivoted, disarming the second man with a swift, calculated stroke that sent the rusted blade tumbling harmlessly into the damp heather. There was no wasted energy, no melodramatic shouting, only the rhythmic, lethal grace of a warrior viewing combat as a scrupulous examination of an opponent's failings. The leader of the mercenaries roared, a sound of frustrated pride, and drew his cavalry sabre, the heavy weapon whistling through the mist. Arthur met him with a cold, iron-hard stillness. He did not retreat. He waited until the last possible second, his grey eyes fixed on the man's center of gravity, and then he moved. It was a blur of blue steel and burlap. The dueling blade moved like a flash of lightning through the grey shroud, parrying the heavy sabre with a strength that should have been impossible for a man of his station. With a precise, fluid twist, Arthur Sterling caught the crossguard of the mercenary's weapon and sent it spinning over the edge of the cliff, the metal clattering against the stones, before being swallowed by the indigo depths of the valley. The leader stood disarmed, his breath hitching in the cold air, his eyes wide with a terror that Elara had only ever seen in the victims of Baron Vane's gambling debts. Arthur did not kill him. He stepped forward, the tip of his dueling blade resting lightly against the man's breastbone, a silent promise of absolute authority. The mist seemed to hold its breath as Arthur Sterling spoke, his voice dropping to a low, resonant frequency that carried the weight of a death sentence. "Return to Julian Vane," Arthur whispered, the words possessing a dark, melancholic gravity. "Inform him that the architecture of his greed is collapsing. Warn him that the woman he thought to buy is under the protection of a man who knows the cost of every lie he has ever spoken. If I see your face in these mountains again, the arithmetic of your survival will reach 0. The mercenaries did not wait for a second warning. They scrambled back into the mist, their retreat a frantic, stumbling departure that echoed through the pass until the silence returned thick and unyielding. Arthur Sterling, standing for a long moment, his dueling blade still extended, his grey eyes staring into the fog as if he could see the very soul of the corruption he was hunting. The adrenaline of the moment began to ebb, leaving behind a raw, pulsing quiet. Elara stood frozen, her rowan stick still clutched in her hand, her mind attempting to balance the ledger of what she had just witnessed. She had married a beggar to defy Lady Catherine, but she had just seen a man who moved with the lethal authority of a king. She realized with a sudden chill that had nothing to do with the damp mountain air that this man had deliberately subjected himself to the humiliation of Catherine's estate. He had stood in the pouring rain, clad in rags, accepting her brass farthing while fully capable of dismantling an entire regiment. The realization was a heavy, complicated weight. She had sought a partner in poverty, a shield against the opulent cruelty of her world, but the man standing before her was entirely solvent in a currency she had not yet identified. Arthur slowly retracted the blade, cleaning the steel with a scrap of linen he produced from his pack before sheathing it back into its hidden architecture. He turned to look at her, and for a moment the mask of the laborer was completely gone. The sorrow wearing a man's coat was still there, but beneath it sat a tactician of terrifying competence. He saw the shock in her eyes, the way she measured the discrepancy between his burlap rags and the aristocratic precision of his dueling. He did not offer a lie, for he knew that Lady Elara Vance was a woman who could see through the most gilded of facades. Instead, he walked toward her, his movements once again assuming the quiet, steady rhythm of the road. "We cannot stay here," Arthur Sterling said, his voice returning to the low rumble of the mountains. "The Baron's hired thieves are broken for now, but Julian Vane is a man who treats a failure as a personal debt. He will send more, and he will send them with more than just rusted sabers. We must find a more secure position before the night claims the pass." He did not offer her a hand. He waited for her to find her own balance, his gaze acknowledging the iron in her spine. Elara nodded, her mind already moving to the next calculation. She realized that the sanctuary she had sought was not a place, but the protection of a man who carried a kingdom in his silence. They moved away from the site of the ambush, the mist closing behind them as if the violence had never occurred. The journey resumed its steady, rhythmic cadence, but the air between them had changed. It was no longer the silence of two strangers. It was the shared secrecy of two partners in a dangerous game. Elara looked at the back of Arthur's head, at the scarred jawline and the broad shoulders that had just stood against the ruin of her world. She thought of her mother, Lady Catherine, counting imaginary gold in a manner that was holding its breath. And then she looked at the dueling blade hidden beneath Arthur's burlap coat. The calculus of her existence had shifted again, the numbers pointing toward a revelation that was as inevitable as the coming winter. The ascent grew steeper, the rocks slick with a persistent, freezing dew. Elara forced her trembling muscles to obey, refusing to utter a single word of complaint. She was no fragile hothouse flower to wither at the first frost. She had navigated the treacherous currents of Catherine's debts, and she would navigate this mountain. Arthur seemed to sense her resolve, adjusting his stride to match hers, without ever drawing attention to the accommodation. It was an intellectual respect translated into physical motion, a silent partnership forged in the shadow of impending danger. By the time they reached a sheltered clearing beneath a natural stone overhang, the sky was the color of a fresh bruise, the violet and indigo bleeding into the black of the approaching night. Arthur Sterling did not immediately build a fire. Instead, he moved with scrupulous intent around the perimeter of the clearing, his eyes searching the shadows for any sign of a lingering threat. He was a man who did not believe in luck. He believed in the architecture of a defense. Only when he was satisfied did he return to the center of the clearing and begin to unpack his meager supplies. But as he reached into his bag, he did not pull out food. He pulled out a tactical map, a detailed rendering of the northern Highlands that possessed notations in a precise, scholarly hand. Arthur smoothed the parchment against a flat stone, the light from the small tinderbox he had finally lit illuminating the complex network of trails and coastal coves. She looked at the man beside her, his grey eyes steady and unyielding. "It is time you understood the nature of the road we are walking, Elara," he said, his voice cutting through the crackle of the wood. "I am not just a man running from a village square. I have spent 7 years hunting the very smuggling ring that ensnared your mother and Baron Vane. The debt of £20,000 you discovered in your father's desk is not merely a bill of sale for your hand. It is the currency of a criminal network that stretches from these peaks to the ports of the south. I am here to dismantle that architecture, stone by stone." Elara knelt beside him, her gaze fixed on the map. She saw the marks indicating the Vance family cove, the hidden routes used by the Baron, and the precise calculations of the smuggling shipments. The competence of the document was staggering. It was the ledger of a man who understood the value of information, better understood the value of gold. She realized then that her marriage had not been an act of desperation for Arthur Sterling. It had been a strategic intersection. He had not just saved her from the Baron, he had recruited her into a war. "You knew about the bill of sale," Elara whispered, her fingers tracing the ink on the map. "You knew what my mother had done before I even stepped into the village square." Arthur looked at her, and for the first time she saw a flicker of profound intellectual respect in his gaze. "I knew the numbers, Elara, but I did not know the woman. I did not know that a daughter of the Vance lineage would have the integrity to offer a brass farthing instead of a title. Being seen by the right persons was not the danger for me. It was the only safety worth the name. He reached out, his hand resting near the map, his posture one of shared burden. Together, we will audit the Baron's ruin, and we will do it with the very integrity he thought he could buy. She reached into the pocket of her coarse burlap shift, and her fingers brushed the smooth metal of the solitary coin she had kept, the twin to the brass farthing she had pressed into his palm. It was worthless to a merchant, yet it had purchased a partnership with a man of towering moral architecture. The fire sputtered, casting long dancing shadows against the stone overhang. Outside, the northern Highlands remained a cold, silent witness to their partnership. Elara looked at the man beside her, the duelist, the scholar, the hunter of shadows, and realized that the estate had finally awoken from its slumber. It was preparing to roar. As she leaned over the map, her experienced hands moving with the same precision as his, she knew that the road ahead would be paved with more than just mud. It would be paved with the truth. The desolate mountain ranges did not merely exist, they conspired. The mist was a living, breathing shroud that clung to the jagged granite ribs of the earth, a damp and grey architecture that seemed to swallow the very concept of time. Lady Elara Vance moved through this landscape like a ghost haunting its own funeral, her rowan walking stick striking the saturated peat with the rhythmic, hollow thud of a ticking clock. The air was a sharp, metallic blade that tasted of damp slate and ancient ice, catching in her throat as she measured her breath against the rising incline. Behind her lay the wreckage of a life built on gilded lies and the arithmetic of maternal greed. Ahead lay a void, a life of burlap and honest labor in a derelict hut that she had chosen over the bed of a predator. Beside her, Arthur Sterling walked with the silent, lethal grace of the mountains themselves, his grey eyes fixed on the horizon as if he were reading a ledger written in the clouds. Lady Elara Vance clutched the lapels of the heavy burlap coat Arthur Sterling had given her, the rough fabric a tactile anchor in the swirling fog. She thought of her ink-marred hands, a permanent mark of the 7 years she had spent auditing the ruin of Vance Manor. She had spent a lifetime in rooms where the furniture was mahogany and the silence was heavy with the scent of cheap tallow and rot. Now, her physical world had shrunk to the weight of her boots and the cold, unyielding pressure of the rowan walking stick in her palm. She was constitutionally exhausted, her muscles vibrating with a fatigue that reached into her very marrow, yet she felt a terrifying crystalline clarity. She had married a beggar to defy Lady Catherine Vance, and in that one act of scandalous arithmetic, she had finally balanced the debt of her own soul. "The wind is turning, Elara," Arthur Sterling said, his voice a low, resonant frequency that seemed to vibrate within the stones beneath their feet. He did not look at her, yet he adjusted his stride with a scrupulous precision, ensuring his broad shoulders acted as a windbreak against the increasingly aggressive Xust. "The mountains are losing their patience with the day. We are nearing the boundary of Ravenscar." He spoke the name not with the reverence a labourer might show for a great estate, but with the quiet, absolute familiarity of an heir describing his own heartbeat. To Lady Elara Vance, Ravenscar was a myth, a name whispered in Oakhaven as a place of shadows and old hard power, a vast territory that owned the wind and the water alike. She imagined the Ravenscar she would find, a cluster of grey, low-roofed cottages huddled against the stone, a place where Arthur Sterling would return to manual toil and she would learn the domestic governance of a pauper's hearth. She expected a hovel with a dirt floor and a hearth that smoked, a place where the architecture of the soul would be tested by the grit of survival. She mentally prepared herself to apply her ledger-keeping skills to the meager economy of a labourer's life. Counting the grains of oats and the pieces of kindling with the same meticulous intent she had once used to hide the dowager's smuggling debts. She did not fear it. In the silence of her mind, a derelict hut with Arthur Sterling felt more like a sanctuary than the finest ballroom in London. The path suddenly widened, the jagged crags of the wild Highlands giving way to a more disciplined landscape. The heather here was not wild but managed, and the granite outcrops were replaced by a low, ancient wall of perfectly fitted stone that stretched into the mist like an iron-hard boundary. They rounded a final steep bend, and the mist seemed to recoil, parting like a heavy velvet curtain to reveal the iron gates of Ravenscar. Lady Elara Vance stopped, her breath catching in her chest as she looked up. These were not the gates of a village or a tenant farm. They were massive, formidable structures of wrought iron and blackened steel, rising 20 feet into the grey sky. They were decorated with the intricate, menacing geometry of a duelist's guard, and at their center sat a massive ducal crest, a falcon with wings outspread clutching a broken sword. "Arthur," Elara whispered, the word barely surviving the local wind. Her eyes swept the gates and then fixed on the man beside her, whose burlap coat was soaked with rain and whose jaw was mapped with the scars of a life in the shadows. "This is no labourer's entrance. This is the perimeter of a sovereign." She expected him to lead her to a small side gate, perhaps a servant's passage hidden in the stone wall. But Arthur Sterling did not move toward the periphery. He walked directly toward the center of the iron architecture, his stride possessing a new upright authority that seemed to command the very air to be still. He did not reach for a bell, and he did not shout. He simply stood before the gates, his presence a dark blot against the formidable metal. The sound that followed was not the creak of old hinges, but the heavy, rhythmic thud of a bolt being drawn back by a dozen hands. The iron gates of Ravenscourt did not just open, they retreated. With a sound like a struck bell echoing through the valley, the massive structures swung wide, revealing a driveway of crushed slate that disappeared into an avenue of ancient, gnarled oaks. Lady Elara Vance expected to see a stable boy or a weary gatekeeper, but as the gates reached their limit, she found herself staring into a line of men that stretched as far as the mist would allow. There were hundreds of them, guards in polished livery the color of midnight, their spines as straight as the pikes they held, their eyes fixed forward with the disciplined stillness of an elite regiment. The estate has awaited in profound silence for 7 years. At the head of the line stood Silas Thorne, no longer dressed in the plain, dusty wool of an Oakhaven clerk. He was clad in black leather and fine wool, a silver falcon pinned to his chest, his posture radiating the lethality of a master-at-arms. As Arthur Sterling stepped across the threshold, Silas Thorne did not bow as a villager might. He dropped to one knee on the wet slate, his head bowed in a gesture of absolute unyielding fealty. Behind him, with the synchronized precision of a falling ledger, 300 men followed suit, the sound of their armor and boots striking the ground in a single, thunderous sovereign salute. "Welcome home, Your Grace," Silas Thorne said, his voice carrying across the clearing with a clarity that shattered the last of Elara's illusions. "The perimeter is secure. The audit of the north is ready to begin." Lady Elara Vance felt the world tilt on its axis, the logic of her reality collapsing into a sum she could not comprehend. She turned her attention to the nobleman she wed for a brass farthing, the ally she protected in the mud of Oakhaven, and followed into the freezing heart of the mountains. Arthur Sterling ignored the guards, and he paid no heed to the sprawling palace of granite and light that was beginning to materialize through the fog behind them, a mausoleum of power that made Vance Manor look like a tenant's cottage. He turned to her, his grey eyes no longer those of a beggar, but of a sovereign owning the very ground they stood upon. He looked at her coarse burlap shift and her ink-stained fingers, and for the first time, he reached out and took her hand with the public sovereign intent of a husband. "You married a beggar to defy a lie, Elara," the Duke of Ravenscourt said, his voice a low melodic rumble that promised a safety she had never known. "And I married a lady who saw the man beneath the rags." The road was hard and the mud was real, but the test of the heart is the only arithmetic that matters in the end. He did not apologize for the deception, for they both understood that the disguise had been a scrupulous necessity. He simply stood there, a sorrow no longer wearing a man's coat, but a duke reclaiming his soul. Lady Elara Vance looked from the kneeling army to the massive, breathing house that sat upon the hill like a crown of stone. She thought of her mother, Lady Catherine, who was likely at that very moment counting the hours until Elara returned in shame to beg for forgiveness. She thought of Baron Vane, who believed he could buy a wife like a piece of livestock. The justice of the moment was so profound, so mathematically perfect, that a small, sharp laugh escaped her lips, a sound of pure, unadulterated triumph that cut through the Highland mist. She was not a beggar's wife, and she was no longer a bargaining chip. She was the mistress of Ravenscourt, and she had won her throne not through birth or through gold, but through the quiet, absolute integrity of her own choice. The journey through the avenue of oaks was a slow burn revelation. As they walked toward the great house, the architecture of the estate revealed itself with the calculated elegance of a masterwork. There were gardens that breathed with the scent of late autumn roses and damp earth, stables that smelled of expensive leather and well-bred horses, and a library whose windows glowed with the warm golden light of 1,000 candles. It was a house that reflected the heart of its master, strong, silent, and built on a foundation of unyielding stone. Lady Elara Vance felt the weight of the Duke's heavy coat still around her shoulders, a sensory anchor that reminded her of the man who had treated her blisters in a derelict barn. The status had changed, but the man had not. They reached the great mahogany doors of the palace, which swung open to reveal a hall of white marble and flickering candlelight. The air here was warm and smelled of beeswax, lavender, and the faint, intellectual scent of old parchment. It was the first honest room Elara had entered in a lifetime, a place where the architecture of the soul was reflected in the very walls. Arthur Sterling led her into the center of the hall, the guards closing the doors behind them with a final echoing thud. He turned to face her, the light from the chandeliers catching the silver of his falcon pin and the depth of the grey in his eyes. "This is Ravenscourt, Elara," he whispered, his hand still holding hers. "It is a house of truth and a house of law. For 7 years I have lived in the shadows to ensure that its foundations remain solvent, and for 7 years I have waited for a woman who could look at a man in a tattered coat and see the king within. He leaned down, his forehead resting against hers, the proximity a bridge between their two worlds. You are the payment for my patience, and I am the protector of your peace. The ledger is balanced. Lady Elara Vance looked up at him, her spine straight and her heart finally at rest. She realized then that being seen by the right person was the only safety worth the name. She had sought a life of poverty to save her dignity, and in doing so she had been rewarded with a kingdom. As the servants began to move through the hall, preparing the rooms for their new mistress, Elara realized that the ancient walls were no longer stifled by dread. The manor was exhaling a warmth that reached into the coldest corners of her spirit. She was Lady Elara Vance, the woman who had married a beggar, and the road ahead was a clean page, waiting for her calloused hands to write a history of earned prosperity and sovereign love. Autumn arrived at the Ravenscar estate, not as a gentle guest, but as a stern creditor, demanding the greenery of summer be paid in the currency of gold and amber. The Highlands turned a bruised, magnificent violet, the mist lingering in the deep creases of the granite peaks like the ghosts of ancient wars. Within the walls of the palace, the atmosphere was a study in profound, quiet restoration. The air no longer carried the stagnant scent of damp, rot and cheap tallow that had characterized Vance Manor. Instead, it was a tapestry of beeswax, cedarwood, and the sharp intellectual fragrance of old parchment and expensive ink. Lady Elara Vance moved through the high-vaulted corridors with a spine of forged steel. She no longer wore the burlap shift that had served as her armor upon the road, yet she had refused the overly ornate silks of the London fashion. She chose instead a gown of deep emerald wool, the color of the Highlands after a storm, and her ledger-worn hands were busy not with the repair of fraying lace, but with the scrupulous audit of a kingdom. The architecture of her soul had found its physical counterpart in Ravenscar. Every room was an honest one, every ledger a transparent record of earned prosperity. Beside her, Arthur Sterling, known now to the world as the Duke of Ravenscar, had discarded the tattered coat of a beggar for the austere, dark finery of his station. He remained a man of few words, his grief having thawed into a watchful, protective stillness. He had carried his hidden anguish for 7 long years, but as he stood by the great library window watching the first frost touch the oaks, he looked like a lord having finally found his north. The silence between them was no longer a void. It was a partnership of 2 intellects who had measured the world and found the truest value in the integrity of a shared silence. The intrusion of the old world arrived on a Tuesday, heralded by the frantic, uneven rattle of a carriage that had seen better decades. Lady Catherine Vance arrived at the iron gates of Ravenscar not as a conqueror, but as a suppliant. Her secret smuggling debts to Baron Vane had finally come due, and the Baron had not been a patient creditor. Vance Manor was being dismantled, its pewter silverware and chipped crystals sold to satisfy the calculations of her vanity. Catherine had come to Ravenscar to beg a loan from the great Duke, whose reputation for iron-hard justice was the only thing she believed could shield her from the Baron's hounds. She did not know that the man who owned the wind and the water of these mountains was the same Arthur she had cursed in the mud of Oakhaven. Catherine was led through the great hall, her chin trembling with a practiced, tragic dignity. She clutched a threadbare lace handkerchief to her throat, her eyes darting greedily over the marble floors and the silver-framed tapestries. She was still counting, still measuring the wealth of others against the void of her own pockets. When the double doors of the throne room swung open, the scent of lavender and ancient stone reached her before the sight did. The room was a cathedral of light, dominated by the massive ducal throne of carved oak and blackened iron. Lady Elara Vance stood at the foot of the dais, her emerald gown trailing behind her, her expression as unyielding as the Highlands themselves. Lady Catherine stopped, her breath catching in a wheeze. She looked at her daughter, the girl she had stripped of her cloak and cast into the rain, and for a moment the arrogance of the dowager flickered in her eyes. "Elara," she whispered, the name a jagged fragment of disbelief. "What are you doing in this house? Have you taken a position as a housekeeper to pay for your beggar's bread? I suppose it is a mercy the Duke allows a woman of your scandalous history to scrub his floors." She did not wait for an answer, her gaze already sweeping the room for the master of the estate. "I am here to see His Grace. I have a matter of extreme urgency regarding the stability of the northern trade. Surely he will not refuse a lady of my standing." The silence in the room had teeth, sharp and unforgiving. From the shadows behind the throne, Arthur Sterling stepped into the golden light of the afternoon sun. He was no longer the scarred laborer with mud on his boots. He wore the midnight blue velvet of his house, the silver ducal crest of Ravenscar glinting like a predator's eye upon his chest. He moved with a lethal, fluid grace that made the very air seem to bow before him. He did not speak immediately. He merely stood beside Elara, his hand resting upon the hilt of his dueling blade, his grey eyes fixed on Lady Catherine with a cold, clinical indifference. The dowager's face turned the color of grey slate. She looked from the Duke to Elara, and then back to the figure she called a shadow in the village square. The arithmetic of her world, built on gilded lies and social facades, finally collapsed under the weight of the truth. The realization was a physical blow. The beggar she had despised, the individual she treated as a piece of refuse, was the most powerful sovereign in the north. Her daughter had not married a pauper to spite her. She had married the only man in the kingdom who could audit Catherine's soul and find it wanting. Lady Catherine's knees buckled, her hysterical laugh turning into a strangled sob. The handkerchief fluttered to the marble floor like a white flag of surrender as she collapsed against the pristine white marble. Elara did not move to catch her. She stood with her spine straight, her gaze fixed on the woman who had sold her hand for £20,000 of smuggling debt. She looked at Silas Thorne, who stood by the door, and gave a single, decisive nod. "See that my mother is moved to the infirmary," Elara commanded, her voice possessing the melodic authority of a woman who had earned her place, "and ensure that she is given a cup of bitter tea. She has spent her life drinking sweetness she could not afford. Perhaps the taste of truth will be more constitutionally sound for her recovery." Arthur looked at his wife, a ghost of a smile touching his scarred lips. The recognition in his eyes was the only safety Elara had ever required. The formal reckoning occurred 3 days later in the same library where Arthur had once corrected the Latin meter of an ancient codex. The room was a sanctuary of knowledge, its walls lined with the leather-bound thoughts of centuries. Lady Catherine sat in a low chair, her hands shaking as she faced the Duke and Lady Elara across a mahogany desk. These were not the imaginary numbers of her vanity. These were the hard, unforgiving audits of her ruin. Elara had spent the previous nights tracing the smuggling bill of sale to its source, connecting the Baron's illegal shipments to the Vance family cove with the surgical precision of an expert accountant. A ledger, she knew, was the one honest room in the world. "The arithmetic is finished, Mother," Elara said, her slender hands resting upon a document bearing the ducal seal. "We have audited your debts and your deeds. The smuggling network you facilitated with Baron Vane has been dismantled by the Duke's men. Julian Vane is currently being held in the Tower, awaiting a trial for high treason and the murder of 2 excise officers. His lands and his life are forfeit to the Crown." She paused, the weight of the silence in the room pressing against the dowager's chest. "Numbers do not lie, Mother. People lie about them. You sold the integrity of this family and the safety of your daughter to cover a life of moral bankruptcy. A ledger must always be balanced, and the price for your survival is restitution." Arthur Sterling stepped forward, his presence a dark, immovable force behind Elara. He placed a heavy iron-bound box upon the desk. Inside lay the smuggling bill of sale, the very document Catherine had used to sign Elara's life away. "Under my ducal authority, I am seizing the Vance lands in their entirety," Arthur declared, his voice a low rumble of absolute law. "The manor, the cove, and the surrounding acreage are now part of the Ravenscar estate. They will be used to house the families of the labourers you displaced and to fund the schools for the children of Oakhaven. You, Lady Catherine, will be provided with a modest cottage on the outskirts of the parish, a cottage no better and no worse than the one you believed your daughter was destined for." Lady Catherine stared at them, her mouth opening and closing in a mute, frantic desperation. She had lived for the facade, and now the facade was being stripped away, leaving her with nothing but the truth. "You cannot do this," she whispered, her eyes fixed on the emerald gown Elara wore. "I am your mother. I gave you life, and you tried to sell it," Elara replied, her tone as cool and unyielding as the Highland frost. "You disowned me in the mud, Mother. You stripped me of my name and my cloak. In doing so, you released me from every debt I owed you. The woman standing before you is not your bargaining chip. I am the Lady of Ravenscar, and the law I serve is one of integrity, not blood." Arthur reached into the iron box and withdrew a small, exquisite object, a golden coronet of delicate falcon wings designed to be worn at the crown of the head. It was a symbol of sovereign partnership, a piece of the Ravenscar legacy that had not been worn in 7 years. With a lethal, quiet grace, Arthur Sterling stepped behind Elara. He did not ask for permission. He placed the golden coronet upon her dark hair, the metal catching the golden light of the late afternoon. It was a crowning of competence, a public acknowledgement of the woman who had run a dying manor by moonlight and followed a beggar through a mountain storm. "Behold the mistress of Ravenscar," Arthur said, his voice echoing through the library like a struck bell. "The auditor of the North, and the only soul in this kingdom who has looked into the darkness and seen the light." Lady Catherine Vance looked at her daughter, and at that moment she finally saw a person instead of an asset. But the realization came too late to save her from the toll of her own greed. She was led from the library by Silas Thorne, her footsteps heavy and hollow as she began her journey to the cottage in the woods. She would spend the rest of her days in the silence she had once feared, counting the cost of a heart that had never known the value of a single brass farthing. The Vance dynasty had crumbled into the mist, and from its ashes, a sovereign justice had been born. The fires were lit in the great hearths of Ravenscar as the first snow of winter began to fall, turning the world into a clean white page. Elara and Arthur stood by the library window, their hands joined, their silhouettes a single dark shape against the golden warmth of the room. The sensory anchors of her new life, the smell of beeswax, the texture of the rowan walking stick by the door, the weight of the golden coronet, were all signs of a sanctuary earned through the fire of defiance. The road ahead was long, and the challenges of governing a kingdom would require every bit of the intellectual parity they had found in each other. But the ledger was finally perfectly balanced. "The shadows have finally lifted from our home, Arthur," Elara whispered, her forehead resting against his shoulder. The Highland wind roared outside, a fierce and wild music, but inside there was only the steady, rhythmic pulse of a heart that had finally found its home. Arthur turned to her, his grey eyes warm with a thaw that would last a lifetime. He did not speak, for the truth was already written in the architecture of their shared peace. A heart, once thought beyond redemption, had proven itself remarkably resilient when given the chance to beat anew in the presence of the right person. As the snow blankets the peaks of the north, we invite you to reflect. What is the true currency of a soul? Is it the titles we inherit, or the integrity we forge in the shadows? I read every reflection from our fireside community below. Thank you for sitting by the fireside with us tonight.